Zyra Calloway's obsession with Kian Mercer had turned dangerous long before that fateful night, but no one saw the warning signs until it was too late. When she stormed into his bedroom, blinded by jealousy and rage, she never imagined that Lorna Whitmore would be the one to walk away, while she would be left bleeding on the floor, her own hatred sealing her fate. Zyra Mendez had always been the type to get what she wanted. At just 18, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around her. Throughout high school, she had been the girl others envied. The one, with the perfect hair, flawless selfies, and a social media following that hung onto her every word. But beneath the surface, her self-worth was deeply tied to one thing: Kian Torres. Kian had been her boyfriend for almost 2 years, though their relationship had been far from stable. They had broken up and gotten back together so many times that their friends had stopped keeping track. Every time he tried to walk away, she found a way to pull him back in. Whether through guilt, manipulation, or making him jealous, Zyra knew how to keep him under her influence. At least that's what she thought. The last time they broke up, she was sure it was just another temporary separation. She hadn't worried about it too much, assuming Kian would come crawling back like he always did. But weeks passed, and he didn't. Instead, she started seeing signs that something was different this time. He wasn't answering her messages. He stopped liking her posts. He wasn't reacting to the cryptic captions she had carefully crafted to get his attention. And then, the ultimate betrayal. She saw him in a picture with another woman. The first time she saw the photo, she laughed. There was no way Kian could have moved on so quickly, especially not with her. Lorna Graves. Zyra barely knew anything about her. She wasn't from their high school, wasn't someone from their usual circle. The woman was older, in her mid-20s, and the complete opposite of what Zyra had expected Kian to go for. Zyra was slim, fit, and obsessed with appearances. Lorna was full-figured, quiet, and had no online presence worth mentioning. She didn't flaunt her looks, didn't post thirst traps, and didn't seem like someone who could ever steal Kian's attention. But she had. Zyra's curiosity turned into something darker. She began searching for Lorna online, scrolling through her few public pictures, dissecting every detail. There wasn't much to find. Lorna wasn't the type to broadcast her life. That frustrated Zyra even more. She wanted to understand what Kian saw in her. What was so special about this woman that he had completely forgotten about Zyra? Then came the moment that turned her jealousy into full-blown rage. A video surfaced on someone's Instagram story. Kian and Lorna sitting together at a bar. Kian had his arm around her, leaning in close, laughing in a way that Zyra hadn't seen in a long time. She had spent months trying to get that version of him back, and here he was, happy with someone else. Worse, with someone she considered beneath her. She felt humiliated. Zyra convinced herself that Kian wasn't in love with Lorna. He couldn't be. He was probably just using her to get over Zyra, or maybe Lorna had tricked him into thinking she was worth his time. Zyra refused to accept that she had been replaced. The idea festered in her mind, growing into something twisted. She started watching their every move, checking Kian's social media obsessively. Whenever he posted a vague caption or a song lyric, she analyzed it, searching for hidden messages that might mean he missed her. But nothing ever pointed back to her. He had completely moved on. That was when she decided she wouldn't sit back and let this happen. She needed to remind Kian of who he truly belonged with. And if Lorna was standing in the way, she would make sure to remove her. Zyra's obsession with Lorna grew stronger with each passing day. She felt like she was losing control, and that was something she had never been able to tolerate. She had spent her entire life making sure things went her way, and the idea that Kian had chosen someone else, someone so undeserving in her eyes, was unbearable. Every thought she had was consumed by them. She imagined their conversations, the way Kian must have been talking to Lorna the same way he used to talk to her. The thought of them being together in private, sharing the kind of moments that once belonged to her, made her physically sick. She started following Lorna in real life, keeping track of where she went. It wasn't hard. Lorna had a predictable routine: work, groceries, home. There was nothing special about her. She didn't have many friends, didn't go out to parties, and seemed to live an incredibly dull life. That only made Zyra angrier. What did she have that was so special? Why would Kian choose boredom over the excitement that Zyra had always given him? Zyra considered confronting Lorna in public, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. She needed something bigger, something that would permanently ruin whatever connection Kian had with her. She tried to find dirt on Lorna, hoping for some scandal that would destroy her image, but there was nothing. No exes coming forward, no embarrassing secrets. It was as if Lorna had lived a completely uneventful life. That only made Zyra more determined to tear her down. She created fake accounts to message Kian, pretending to be strangers warning him about Lorna. She sent him anonymous texts, hoping to plant doubts in his mind, but nothing worked. He never responded. He had completely shut her out. That realization stung more than anything. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was happy without her, and that was unacceptable. Then came the moment that pushed her over the edge. Late one night, as she scrolled through social media, she saw a picture that made her heart stop. It was Kian, sitting on Lorna's couch, holding a plate of food, with a relaxed smile on his face. The caption was simple, but devastating. Home. That one word shattered every last restraint Zyra had. Kian had never called her place home. He had always kept his distance, never letting their relationship reach that level of comfort. But with Lorna, he looked at peace. That was something Zyra couldn't allow. She didn't think twice. She needed to act now. She had no concrete plan, just a burning need to put an end to whatever was happening between them. She knew where Lorna lived, had watched her enough times to know the layout of the apartment complex. That night, she went through Kian's old things, searching for something she could use. Among the pile of memories she had refused to throw away, she found a small knife he had once carried for protection. It wasn't much, but it was enough to intimidate. Zyra convinced herself she wouldn't use it, just scare Lorna, wake Kian up, and force him to see the truth. He needed to be reminded of who he really belonged with. He needed to be snapped out of whatever spell Lorna had cast on him. And if Lorna put up a fight, Zyra was ready. She waited until the early hours of the morning, when she knew they would both be asleep. Her heart pounded with excitement and rage as she approached Lorna's building, moving through the shadows like a predator closing in on its prey. She had gone over every possibility in her mind, convinced herself that no matter what happened, she would come out on top. As she reached the apartment window, she noticed something that made her smirk. Lorna had left it slightly open. It was almost too easy. Zyra's breath was steady as she pushed the window open wider, carefully hoisting herself up and slipping inside. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hum of a refrigerator and the soft ticking of a clock. The dim glow from a nightlight in the hallway cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the space feel unfamiliar and surreal. But none of that mattered to Zyra. Her focus was on one thing: reclaiming what was hers. She crept forward, her bare feet barely making a sound. Against the wooden floor, every step fueled the fire inside her. In her mind, this wasn't a crime, it was justice. Kian had been stolen from her, manipulated by someone who had no right to him. She had spent years molding him, making him the man he was, and she wasn't about to let someone like Lorna take all of that away. She reached the bedroom door and slowly pushed it open. The sight before her made her stomach twist. Kian and Lorna lay tangled together under the covers, breathing in sync, lost in peaceful sleep. They looked comfortable, as if they belonged together. The vision sent a fresh wave of rage crashing through Zyra's body. Without hesitation, she stormed forward and yanked the blanket away, her presence like a violent storm disrupting the calm. Kian stirred slightly, but Lorna was the first to react. Her eyes shot open, confusion flashing across her face before turning to fear as she registered the intruder standing over her. Zyra wasted no time. She lunged at Lorna, gripping her wrist. With brutal force. She expected her to cower, to break down in terror, to be the weak and pathetic woman Zyra had imagined her to be, but that didn't happen. Lorna fought back. With unexpected strength, she twisted her arm free and shoved Zyra hard, sending her stumbling back. Zyra barely had time to process what had happened before Lorna was on her, grabbing at her arms, trying to restrain her. The room erupted into chaos. Sheets tangling, furniture shaking, gasps and grunts breaking the silence of the night. Zyra thrashed wildly, her hand brushing against the knife tucked into her waistband. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, pulling it free in a desperate attempt to regain control. She swung it forward, expecting Lorna to shrink back in fear. But Lorna didn't. Instead, she grabbed Zyra's wrist, twisting it with force. Zyra hadn't anticipated. A sharp pain shot through her arm as she lost control of the weapon. The knife slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the floor. Before she could react, Lorna shoved her again, this time with everything she had. Zyra lost her footing. The room spun as she fell backward, her body twisting awkwardly before crashing down onto the floor. A sharp, hot pain bloomed in her stomach, radiating outward in a wave of agony. She didn't understand what had happened. At first, she tried to move, but something felt wrong. Then she saw it. The knife. Her own knife. It was buried in her abdomen, the handle sticking out like some cruel joke. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, but even as she tried to pull it free, her strength was fading. Lorna backed away, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her hands shaking from the adrenaline. Kian had fully woken up now, staring at the scene in horror, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Zyra's vision blurred. The rage, the obsession, the jealousy that had burned so brightly inside her only moments ago was slipping away, replaced by something colder. She had come here to destroy Lorna, to take back what was hers. Instead, she had destroyed herself. Zyra's body trembled as she lay on the floor, the sharp sting in her abdomen intensifying with each shallow breath. The warmth of her own blood spread beneath her, soaking into the hardwood, creating a dark pool that grew larger by the second. Her mind refused to accept what had happened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to win. She was supposed to show Kian that Lorna wasn't right for him, but now she was slipping, her strength fading faster than she could comprehend. Lorna stood frozen, her wide eyes locked onto Zyra's crumpled form. Her hands trembled violently, her breath coming in short gasps, still reeling from the struggle. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She had only defended, herself acted on instinct, fought for survival. Yet, there Zyra was, her once fiery presence reduced to a wounded, gasping mess on the floor. Kian scrambled out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight of blood made his stomach turn, but panic overrode everything else. He dropped to his knees beside Zyra, pressing his hands against her wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. He shouted Lorna's name, telling her to do something, call for help, get a towel, anything. But Lorna remained frozen, unable to move. Zyra's vision blurred, but she could still see Kian hovering over her, his hands on her, his face filled with panic. For a brief moment, she felt satisfaction. He was finally looking at her again, finally giving her his undivided attention. The pain didn't matter. The blood didn't matter. He was with her. He cared. But then, reality set in. He wasn't looking at her with love or longing. There was no regret in his eyes, no realization that he had made a mistake choosing Lorna. All she saw was fear, concern, not for her, but for the situation itself. She wasn't the love of his life, the one he was desperate to save. She was just a problem now, an emergency that needed to be handled. Rage tried to flare inside her, but her body was too weak to respond. The fight was over. She had lost. Lorna finally snapped out of her daze. rushing toward her phone with shaking hands. She dialed for an ambulance, her voice barely steady as she gave the address, her mind racing over what had just happened. She had never wanted this. She had never asked for any of this. She had only been living her life, and somehow it had all spiraled into chaos. The minutes stretched on like hours. Kian kept pressure on Zyra's wound, but her breathing was growing, shallower. Her eyelids fluttered, her body growing cold despite the warmth of the room. She wanted to say something, to make Kian promise he would never forget her, to tell Lorna that she hadn't won, not really, but the words wouldn't come. Then, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed against the walls, shadows moving frantically outside as paramedics rushed into the apartment. The small bedroom became a scene of controlled chaos as they worked quickly, checking Zyra's pulse, assessing the damage. Kian and Lorna were pushed aside as the professionals took over. Zyra barely felt anything anymore. The voices around her grew muffled, the lights above her growing dimmer. She could feel herself slipping away, her body shutting down despite the desperate attempts to save her. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, her last thought wasn't of Kian, or Lorna, or even the life she was about to lose. It was a single, bitter realization. She had done this to herself. The ambulance sped through the empty streets, its sirens piercing the quiet night. Inside, the paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Zyra. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. They shouted orders to one another, pressing gauze against the wound, hooking up IVs, trying to keep her conscious. But Zyra barely heard them. Her world was slipping further away with each passing second, her body growing colder despite the heat in the enclosed space. The flashing lights illuminated Kian and Lorna, who stood frozen outside the apartment building, watching as the ambulance disappeared down the street. Neither of them spoke. The reality of what had just happened was too heavy, too overwhelming. Kian's hands were still stained with blood, Zyra's blood. Lorna's body trembled, the adrenaline fading, leaving her drained and numb. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered among themselves, glancing between Lorna and Kian, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Others had their phones out, recording the aftermath, the flashing police lights reflecting off their screens. The chaos of the night had become a spectacle, another story to be passed around, another rumor to spread. When the police approached, Lorna forced herself to speak, recounting what had happened with as much clarity as she could manage. She explained how Zyra had broken in, how she had attacked her, how the struggle had ended with the knife buried in Zyra's own stomach. Her voice wavered, but she told the truth. Kian backed up her story, his face pale, his hands gripping his knees as he tried to steady himself. The officers took notes, exchanged glances, and then one of them spoke. Lorna and Kian weren't under arrest, not yet, but they needed to come to the station for questioning. It was standard procedure in a case like this. Someone had been seriously injured, and the police needed to determine exactly what had led to that moment. By the time they arrived at the station, the exhaustion had set in. The sterile walls, the fluorescent lighting, the endless questions. It all felt surreal. Lorna repeated her story again, answering every detail as best as she could. Kian did the same, his voice void of emotion, his mind still struggling to process everything. Hours passed. Finally, an officer came in with an update. Zyra hadn't made it. The words hit like a stone dropping into deep water. Lorna inhaled sharply, her stomach twisting. She had known it was bad, had seen the blood, had felt the desperation in the room as paramedics worked on Zyra. But now, it was final. Zyra was gone. Kian sat still for a moment, staring blankly at the table. His face didn't change, but Lorna could see the weight of it settling onto him. Zyra had once been a huge part of his life. No matter how much had changed, she had still been someone he had once loved, someone he had shared moments with. and now she was dead. The police reviewed the case carefully, based on the evidence, the forced entry, and the accounts from both. Kian and Lorna, it was determined to be self-defense. No charges would be filed, but that didn't make it easier. The reality of what had happened would stay with them forever. In the days that followed, the story spread across social media, local news stations, and gossip sites. People speculated, twisted the truth, added their own versions of events. Some painted Zyra as a tragic figure, a young woman destroyed by obsession. Others saw her as a villain, someone who had let jealousy consume her until it led to her downfall. But for Kian and Lorna, there was no simple way to look at it. No matter how the world framed the story, one truth remained. Zyra had let her jealousy consume her, and in the end, it had destroyed her completely.